What I propose, since I usually speak too long, is nonetheless to follow the steps of our good friend Giorgio Agamben, and I also decided to be as boring as possible. That is to say, I want to do some solid job. I want to avoid as much as possible my usual mistake of just jumping here and there and do what? Some of you know that in his seminar 17, L'Envers de la Psychanalyse, the other side, the obverse of psychoanalysis, Jacques Lacan from 1969-70, Jacques Lacan developed the so-called matrix scheme of 4 discourses. I want to proceed simply in 2 steps. First, to explain in very simple terms, to give a kind of a systematic account, without bothering with too big methodological questions, how is he right, and so on, just to give you an idea of how this works, and then, more crucial, in part 2, the more substantial part, to see how the focus of this theory, which is the passage from the discourse of master to the discourse of university, how it can serve as a conceptual tool to grasp what is going on today, the new forms of authority, inclusive of what it was already said here about states of exception and so on and all that. Okay, so if you will excuse me for the first half, which will be a little bit more boring than maybe some of you expect. So, L'Envers de la Psychanalyse, this seminar of Lacan, this is the first thing to remember, is Lacan's response to the events of '68. The premise of this seminar is best captured by Lacan's reversal of the well-known anti-structuralist graffiti from the Paris walls of '68, Les structures ne descendent pas dans la rue. The structures do not walk on the streets. The idea being structuralist abstract schemes, now the real thing, nothing to do. I think that Lacan said this first in a meeting of the French Society of Philosophy, apropos where Michel Foucault presented a talk, What is Author? And in a discussion, Lacan emphatically claimed that if there is anything that the events of '68 prove, is that precisely structures in the structuralist, so-called structuralist sense, do walk along the streets. In other words, that you can account for what occurred in '68, for this kind of outburst in terms of the structural changes, permutations, and so on, and so on. For Lacan, the key to these events, and I don't even agree with Lacan's account of it, but his interest is focused on, as already said, on the passage. This is the key passage, from discourse of the master to the discourse of university, which is why, for Lacan, it is crucial for him. No wonder that the revolt of '68 was located at the universities. As such, for Lacan, this revolt only signaled the shift to new forms of domination in which the scientific discourse legitimizes new relations of domination. I think that Lacan's underlying premise here is, this is at least one aspect of it, and here I'm critical of Lacan, skeptic conservative. His diagnosis, underlying this is an attitude which I oppose very much, this enlightened conservative attitude of, revolutionary explosion is good, but the day after domination turns in a new, maybe even more oppressive form. This diagnosis of Lacan is best captured by his famous retort to the student revolutionaries, where he says, as hysterics, you are asking for, you demand a new master, you will get one. This passage of discourse of master, let's simplify the traditional discourse of power, to the discourse of university, can also be conceived in more general terms, generally as the passage from the pre-revolutionary ancien regime to the post-revolutionary new master, who does not want to admit that he is one, but proposes presents himself as a mere servant of the people. In Nietzsche's terms, it is the passage from master's ethics to slave morality. And this perhaps enables us a new approach to Nietzsche. When Nietzsche scornfully dismisses slave morality, I think that Nietzsche can be redeemed here, that he is not truly attacking so-called lower classes as such, but rather the new masters who are no longer ready to assume the title of the master. I think if you read closely Nietzsche, slave is not the true slave. Slave is this fake new master who doesn't even want to be master, who is not ready to assume directly the position of the master. So let me do now a little bit of this elementary pedagogy. The starting point of this so-called matrix of the four discourses is Lacan's well-known so-called definition. I say so-called not to criticize Lacan because it's obviously circular, in the sense of that the term to be defined this is conscious. Lacan's paradox is included in what is supposed to define him. A signifier is that which represents the subject for another signifier. So how are we to read this obviously circular definition? I'm sorry for those of you who know Lacan. I'm sure at least some of you, at least those of you, I will not say who, but whose name begins with A and family name with B, like that. Maybe you know even more Lacan, so I'm sorry for those. No? Try to listen to this, but this definition is to be conceived in opposition, it's meant as a reversal, opposition of the standard definition of sign. Sign as that which represents something for somebody. So what would this mean? Let me give you 2-3 very elementary examples. For example, the old style hospital bed, now it's more digitalized, but I always admire them. You know how you lie here and at the feet you have, so that of course you as a patient, you don't see it, you have this mysterious, how do you call it, board with, you know, temperature up and down, what medicine, and so on and so on and so on. I think it's, okay, this represents you, the patient, no? Your state, your changes, temperature, blah, blah, what medicines are you taking, but it represents you for whom? Now you would say, oh, but it's for another subject, obviously. It is simply for the stupid doctor or the usually not so stupid nurses who come there to read it. No, I claim that that's not necessary. It can even happen ideally. A person is not needed there. It would be even more ideal that that would be just then, instead of being there, displayed for a human gaze, it could have been simply directly connected to a computer in the sense of another chain of knowledge. It's literally, it presents you for the chain of medical knowledge. It is to be inscribed into medical knowledge. Or to give you even a more radical example, and at the same time simpler, of this signifier represent the subject for another signifier, the symptom. Standard, good old-fashioned, they no longer made them today as they did in the good old days, hysterical, conversion, hysteria, where, okay, we all know the symptom is a ciphered message, but to whom? Definitely not to another human being, because nobody, not even you, nobody really understands it. But nonetheless, a symptom accomplishes its function the moment it is produced, since it is inscribed into the big other, you know, it's put into circulation. So, based on this, Lacan produced the following scheme. A subject is represented by a signifier, the one which is your stand-in within the field of, within the symbolic order. So something, let's say your name or whatever, usually it's not even your name, stands for you, represents you in the symbolic order. And this is the ABC of Lacanian theory. I'm giving you a watered-down version. This representation, signifying symbolic representation, always structurally fails, and the failure, this failure, as it were, is embodied in what Lacan calls l'objectita, the object cause of desire. Is precisely that which remains, the leftover, the excess, that which is not caught in the logic of symbolic representation. Now, this is the starting point. Then what Lacan does is to further elaborate this scheme. In what terms? First, Lacan calls these 4 places this agent, truth, other, production. That is to say, the agent is, to put it in very simple terms, and simplify to the utmost, the apparent, obvious, the agent simply of the discourse. The position of enunciation, the position from which a discourse is spoken. You can speak as a master, later we'll see. You can speak as a split hysterical subject. The master is the one who, in pure performativity, knows what he says what he knows, directly stated. You can speak from the position of knowledge, university discourse, where you just state what's going on without subjective engagement, and you can speak from the position of the analyst, which is this one, that is to say, you speak precisely from the position of the impossible remainder, excess, that which resists being included into the symbolic network. So Lacan's idea then is a very simple one. We have first this zero-level discourse, and you know, now today it's still, although the word is already a little bit out of fashion, it's still fashionable to use the word discourse like just out of snobbery often. Like instead of saying let's analyze, I don't know, the last speech by George Bush, it sounds much deeper if you say the discourse of George Bush, no? Lacan is not responsible for this. For him, discourse means le lien social, social link. It's the minimal scheme of social link. Again, it's the apparent. Again, it's the level of. You can even put it in these terms: enunciated enunciation. Let's call it naively, apparent level of appearances, not apparent. Sorry, it's crucial distinction. And then, so after establishing this scheme, Lacan does the following. His idea is then that this is, of course, the elementary operation, the zero-level discourse, as it were, the first gesture. Simply, a signifier represents you, there is a remainder. And then, for Lacan, there are 3 variations of these 3 possible ways to, as it were, react to the deadlock of this discourse. These are, and you arrive at them by simply, in a clockwise way, turning around for 1/4 each time the terms in these 4 places. So you get master's discourse, university discourse, hysterical discourse, the discourse of the analyst. Okay, that's the zero level. But now, this means nothing, of course, the way I put it now. So let's go step by step. First, the master's discourse. The discourse of the master is, for Lacan, the basic one. It provides, as it were, the basic matrix. As already said, a subject is represented by the signifier for another signifier, or for the chain of the signifiers. Lacan calls S1 the master signifier. S2 is not simply another signifier, but rather the chain of signifiers. He refers to it as knowledge. Knowledge as opposed to pure tautological master's gesture. And then we have, as already said, since this symbolic representation structurally fails, the remainder, the object, what Lacan calls l'objectit A, the object small a. Here already we find the first tension. Usually, incidentally, why is this line curved? It signals, to simplify to the utmost, that things do not quite function, how should I put it, that here trouble emerges. So, Lacan's point, to put it very simply, is the following one. In the master's discourse, you have this master's gesture, the big, the one signifier, which introduces order or whatever, tries to organize the field of knowledge. It fails, and this, you should also remember, this is for Lacan also this confrontation, or like a coupling of the subject with object, in the sense of object cause of desire, is for Lacan also the formula of fantasy. So the point is here very convincing and simple for Lacan. Let's put it in extremely ridiculously even simplified terms. You make a statement, produce the one for the field of knowledge. You say something. But for Lacan, there is always a gap between what you say and what Lacan calls the position of enunciation. What you wanted to say by saying this. For Lacan, the most elementary gap of meaning is always best encapsulated in this question: okay, you are telling me this, but why are you telling me this? And this gap for Lacan, let me give you, I improvised already in my class, I want to elaborate it now a little bit further. For example, the best, since we are here in academia, I cannot resist from giving you the example of this gap between enunciated enunciation from the standard rules of academic discourse. Let us say that after this very talk here, I will approach full of hope with this idiotic naivety, some of you, and ask you, how did you like my talk? Let's say that you will think, oh, it was boring, stupid. But you know that in academic discourse, you are not supposed to answer like this. And as you also probably know, it's strictly codified how you answer. You say, oh, it was interesting, no? That's the academic way to say it was stupid and boring, polite one, you know? Okay, so now a naive idiot would have said, but okay, why not say it directly? So what if you were to tell me it was boring and stupid? I claim that in this way, the message would not be simply it was boring and stupid. The rules are, if you want to tell me it was boring and stupid, without the excessive surplus message smuggled into it, that because you are an idiot, without targeting me as a person, you can only say it was interesting. If you want to pass, because if you tell me it was boring and stupid, meaning just this, that it was really boring and stupid, then you should say it was interesting. In other words, in that case, I have the full right to tell you, listen, if you really just meant that it's boring and stupid, why didn't you simply tell me that it's interesting? Why did you? You got it. An enunciated statement never coincides with itself. You have always this more. And Lacan's point is the following one, that the structural role of fantasy is precisely to provide a fantasized answer to this more, to this, you told me that, but why are you telling me this? It's fantasy. In the ship, for example, I don't know, at the most let's take the ultimate example of ideology, anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is precisely the answer to this non-transparency of the social body. It's like this, blah, blah, but why? What's going on? Anti-Semitic, Jewish plot, and so on and so on. So again, fantasy fills in for, or if you want, provides an answer to this primordial, as Lacan puts it, referring to terms of an old novel where the words are in Italian, to this che vuoi, what do you want? And we can also read this discourse in another way, which maybe will make it more plastic. These two levels, a very primitive example, but I was told by some psychologists that it's true. Let's say you are a high-level executive. You give orders and so on. Unfortunately, in order to survive, you need to go once a week to a prostitute to whip you. You know this famous story, which I heard it's even true, that the more you are in command, the more you need some fantasy realized in the sense of masochistic ritual which sustains you, and so on and so on. Another philosophical, Lacan's point here is that again, the explicit social link has to be sustained with fantasies. Another crucial point here is, but I don't have time to develop it now, it's that one way to conceive Lacan's revolution is as writing a fourth critique of Kant. As you know, in Kant we have three critiques: pure reason, practical reason, judgment, Urteilskraft. for Kant, as he explicitly emphasized, the faculty of desiring is inherently pathological. Pathological in the sense of being always linked to contingent worldly empirical object. There is no, as Kant puts it, there is no pure faculty of desiring. So desiring is as such pathological. But for Lacan, psychoanalysis precisely is a kind of critique of pure desire. That is to say, for Lacan, there is a pure non-pathological, a priori proto-transcendental object cause of desire. And this precisely is the object small a, which is kind of a transcendental element, a priori element in the logic of desire. Now let's go a step further here. How do these two operate, S1, S2? Now, it's not only that they are heterogeneous in a very specific way. The first mistake to avoid here is to confuse them with any of these old, how do you call them, polar opposite, binary couples, you know, like, I don't know, masculine, feminine, yin, yang, or whatever, positive, negative. Lacan's theory is here much nicer. It is that, how to put it, in a way, it's a kind of a circular mechanism where each stands in for the other's lack. They are not structurally at the same level. S1 enters to fill in the lack of S2 and vice versa. What do I mean by this? Let me first give you the first example. Let's say that this is the phallic, as Lacan sometimes put it, masculine signifier. For Lacan, when he says woman doesn't exist, he precisely means that there is no feminine counterpoint to the masculine phallic signifier, which incidentally is for me the ultimate argument for feminism, but that's another story. What I want to tell you only is that this standard accusation then, you know, so fashionable in so-called postmodern deconstructionism of binary logic, Lacan, Lacan I think is the most radical undermining of binary logic. For Lacan, what he calls primordial repression is, as he puts it, the repression, the lack, the void of the binary signifier. Like you have only one and then the counterpoint that would introduce, like you have, how should I put it, yin without yang, or whichever way you put it. And on the place of this lack, the multitude then emerges. So Lacan has a very nice abstract, even philosophical, or what it was called 20 years ago, 40 years ago, logic of the signifier level of how multitude emerges. You have the one, and here I think there are some legitimate links, but I'm proceeding very fast, between all this relation and what Alain Badiou was explaining to you with all these formulas. That is to say, how the minimal matrix of this tension is that, of course, of empty set. That is to say that the radical difference is not primordially a difference between an element and another element, but how to put it, a pure difference between an element at its own place, an element as it, and its own void. And then, this minimal gap, already in German idealism, even I think in medieval logic, they call it symbolic reduplicatio, that the moment we are in the order of science, you have always a minimal gap between an element at its place. And to fill in this gap, you need the S2. Now, sorry if I repeat all jokes from my talk, but they are worth repeating here. The best example I could think about this is the stupid, but I love it. You know, Woody Allen film, the parody on Tolstoy, not War and Peace, it's called War and Love, which is about Tolstoy. Throughout the entire movie, Tolstoy, Tolstoy, Tolstoy. Now, every normal Western subject has here, okay, where is Dostoevsky? No Dostoevsky. But that's nicely. So, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, this one is missing. But what you get instead of this is an exploding multitude. In a wonderful scene of the film, the two main characters get involved in a conversation where all the Dostoevsky titles are condensed. Like, have you seen that idiot? Ah, you mean the Karamazov brother? He got the punishment for it, then he went underground, he was too furious. You know, like all the titles. It's like, you know, the binary signifier is missing, you get the explosion. So again, this is, I think, I don't have time to work on it more, but an extremely important point, that this imbalance, they are not, this is not, how to put it, this is not the same field, you know. The original tension is not S1, S2. It is even, if I put it this way, because one of the Lacanian names of this leg is subject. It is, signifier represents the subject, but then this, you have the tension between 1 and 0, and to fill in this 0, you get S2. It's even a very Hegelian theory of how the first contradiction is purely tautological, contradiction inherent to the one itself, and then as an attempt to fill in this gap, you get the multitude, the explosion. But we can also generate this tension from the other side, that the S2, the chain, is never complete, and in order to complete the chain, you have to have an excessive element which appears to be one of the elements of the chain, but to use this fashionable expression which one is almost ashamed to use it today, feels which is signifier of the lack of the signifier. That is to say, it appears to be a positive signifier but just feels in the lack. Okay, just to give you a couple of old examples which are probably even known to you. For example, even with Marx, let me be a little bit critical of Marx. You know that in Marx you get, in his Grundrisse, a certain categorization, a series of so-called mode of production. You have this, the so-called whatever, primitive, pre-class society, whatever mode of production. You have Asiatic mode of production, so-called Oriental despotism. You have slave, ancient Greek, slave mode of production, feudal, capitalist, and whatever comes afterwards, socialism or whatever. Okay, now, but if you look at it closely, it is clear how Marx arrived at the Asiatic mode of production. That what appears to be just one mode in the series was really generated in a different way. It was that, to cut a long story short, Marx, the original categorization was just the one which was incidentally later established, codified by Stalinism, which is why Stalinists always rejected the notion of Asiatic. It was primitive tribal societies, simply slave, feudalism, capitalism, communism. Then Marx encountered a whole series of totally heterogeneous, ultimately, modes of, okay, not concept modes of production, but let's say productive organization, which did not fit any of these modes. And while the Asiatic mode of production appears to be a positive term at the same level of others, it is really like, you know, that famous passage from Borges quoted by Foucault, how the list includes all. It's basically a container for all those modes which do not fit the official category. So you got the point. Apparently we had a complete list, but which includes everything, but in order to have it, we need to include an element which appears deceivingly as one in the series, but it is effectively a stand-in. Le tenant-lieu, as they put it. It sounds better in French. The placeholder within the system of what escapes, of that which the system, based on its structuring principle, cannot grasp. We have the same, for example, I don't know, this is the Spinoza's classical criticism of the traditional notion of God as the one up there and so on. That it's simply that the entire positive content of the notion of God is the lack of our knowledge. We know things, then when we don't know it, we call that God. So, okay, we may agree, disagree with it, but the point is simply that an element which appears as a positive term in itself, it just gives body to the lack. You have here numerous other examples, like, for example, in physics, phlogiston, you know. It appears to name a positive physical element, but it simply objectivizes the failure, the lack of knowledge. So, to conclude, the lesson here is that there is no reason to be dismissive of the discourse of the master. You know, it has nothing to do with, bad master, authoritarian repression, or whatever. The master's gesture is the founding gesture of every social link. You know what would be the best example, maybe, of the master's gesture? Imagine a situation of confusion, like a certain social order is disintegrated also, its ideology, so you don't know where you stand. I mean, there is no, as we put it today in fashionable terms, global narrative, which allows you, and then at that point you have ideological struggle for new hegemony, and at that point you get a new term, when somebody pronounces the right word, which is usually even an empty word, but it's as if, how should I put it, the word is pronounced and there is a new order. My favorite example, I'm sorry to insist on it, but because it's simply the most plastic, would be, let's say, Germany in the late 20s. We have so-called moral decadence, economic crisis, of course, whatever you want, German humiliation, and people were simply, large amounts of people, disoriented. And for Hitler's Jew was, like you are confused, then Hitler says Jewish plot, aha, things are clear, the new narrative. That's the basic idea of if you want, of the master discourse. It's not a whole new, the point, you learn nothing new, it's just a new rearticulation which all of a sudden makes things transparent. That's the master's discourse. But again, you need fantasies to sustain it because of its failure and so on and so on. Now, let's go slowly on. What happens then if we make one shift order, that is to say, the university discourse. In the university discourse, as you see, the position of the agent is neutral knowledge. It's knowledge. This knowledge is addressed precisely to that remainder. So you see the nice logic of Lacan. This object, small a, was the excess of the master's discourse. When that fails, the idea is, of course, let's account for that one. Let's focus our knowledge on that one. But you remember, I wrote on the other side, that's the agent and this is the truth. So already you can see what's Lacan's point. It is that the truth of the university discourse, which the best naive example today would be the expert discourse, is that it's a disavowed master's discourse. What does this mean? And of course, as such, it produces subjectivity. How are we to read this? Let me give you first one example, which I think, from our daily experience even, which I think perfectly renders this shift, imperceptible shift between university discourse and master's discourse. The medical discourse. The paradox of the medical discourse is that, and an old, rather conservative Lacanian wrote nonetheless 20 years ago a nice book, Jean Claver, called L'Ordre Médical, where he argued this, I think that at this level he was right, namely that the medical discourse is precisely the paradox of a discourse which appears to be purely scientific, university, although that's another story. For Lacan, science does not have the structure of university discourse. It's another, but nonetheless, it's not. But the point is that which still functions as master's discourse. You know how you can detect this? You are horrified if a doctor simply treats you as an object. There is always, with the figure of a doctor, this mystical excess. Like it's not just knowledge. The doctor has to understand you, has to have some special insight. The horror is that a doctor, medical doctor, should not be reduced to simple, that, medicine, as they like to put it, medicine demands also a deep understanding of the person. Medicine should not be simply science. But, okay, a more classical example, if you want it, of the master, of how the position of the master is the truth of The university discourse would be, well, let's take a political example, would be today's economists, market experts, who advocate strong budgetary measures, cut welfare and so on, as a necessity imposed by the experts' neutral expertise, devoid of any ideological biases. This is, I think, what they don't admit is that in order for these budget measures, that they are really not neutral, that in order for economy to function the way they describe it, there are certain power relations already. It's kind of a disavowed dimension of power. That is to say, this is, if you want, the basic cheating of the university discourse. It presents itself as a simple, objective, neutral knowledge, but you have it is as if you know. You are not even a subject for me, I just treat you as an object, that's the truth of the things, but nonetheless, its truth is that still you are confronted with this disavowed dimension of the master. Then let's go on. Next, change the other way to undermine or to change to step out of the position of the master's discourse is what Lacan calls hysterical discourse. Here also the matrix works perfectly because this is what defines hysteria for Lacan. Hysteria is the subject, the split subject, provoking the master. In what way? Tell me. What the hysteric does is addresses the master, provoking him. I want you to produce knowledge about what I am as the cause of desire, as object. That is to say, to put it in very naive terms, let's take a king. What would be? The model would be Shakespeare, Richard the Second, probably. The moment you no longer accept with full naivety of the master, I am a king. But the moment you get caught into this, am I really the king? Why am I a king? At this point, hystericization begins, and again you address the figure of the master. Tell me, let me know what I am. Here we have already a very nice point of Lacanian theory which should be kept in mind, which is that for Lacan, all this poetry, the object of desire is originally lost and so on. But for Lacan, the lost object of desire is ultimately not out there what I desire, it is rather me, myself, as an object. That is to say, the enigma is the following one. Imagine a small child. He knows that, or she, that for parents, brothers, sisters, he is an object of libidinal investment. But, the primordial enigma is why? What do they see in me? What kind of, this is for Lacan the primordial enigma. What kind of an object I am? If that idiot says she loves me, I love you, why? What does he see in me? This inexplicable excess in me. Or to put it in another way, if the master gives you your socio-symbolic ideological identity, the classical example, you are my wife, then the hysterical question is, but what do you see in me that I am your wife? Why am I your wife? This questioning, which is why for Lacan there is a hysterical aspect of every revolutionary explosion and so on and so on. Then, this is the analyst discourse, which is strangely similar to hysterical discourse. To the discourse of perversion. Because this is also Lacan's formula of perversion. What does Lacan mean by this? Perversion is truly a contrast, the opposite of hysteria. In the minimal definition of hysteria is questioning. You question your symbolic identity. You question what is the object in me which makes me what I am. Which is why in my first book already I focus on a wonderful painting I think of one of the pre-Raphaelites which angel brought to Virgin Mary the news that she is pregnant? Gabriel, I think. Yeah. And it's a wonderful painting because the Virgin Mary is totally perplexed. Like, you are saying this, but shit, what did I do? It's like, why? What? This, like, you are informing me that that's my historical role. Why? What did I do? And I think even the movie, which I otherwise don't like, because I don't like Martin Scorsese, but nonetheless, the idea is not bad. He's The Last Temptation of Christ. The beauty of it is that it's this kind of historicization of Christ. Christ doesn't, what's happening? Why do I have these miracles? Why am I God's son? No, Christ cannot accept this identity. Okay, but in contrast to this hysterical doubt, which is why I love them, the pervert subject for Lacan is not simply, no, perversion is for Lacan a formal, symbolic, I don't like the word structure, but okay, structure. It has nothing to do with, oh my God, what horrible things you are doing. No, in the sense that a pervert precisely does not have any question. He knows. The pervert position is, I know perfectly what you, the subject, need, and I will do it for you. You know, you want to be whipped, you want to be tortured, whatever. No, that's the pervert's position is precisely this kind of total self-instrumentalization, which is why I think that the classical Stalinism was a pervert discourse. Not because, oh my God, what horrible things they were doing, but because if you read Stalinist, but on the other hand, I think that fascism was a perverted, not a good term, a kind of a fake attempt to return to the discourse of the master. Because Stalin is definitely not, you totally miss it, although privately Stalin was usually, ironically, addressed as master. No, I don't know, but the nickname for Stalin in the inner circle around him was Khazyain, which is the Russian word for master, no? But the structure of this, in what sense? If you read the great Stalinist text, it's always this obsession that there is a objective chain of logic of history, necessity, and we are merely instruments of historical necessity, this total self-instrumentalization. What happens now are then analysts perverts. The whole point is that for the pervert, the big other exists still. He just fully knows what the big other wants. For example, in Stalinism, in the guise of this inexorable historical necessity, and we are just the instruments of it, no? But what happens if the big other doesn't exist? In the sense that if there is no consistent symbolic order, then all this changes totally. You have, here would be the patient, and the analyst stands precisely for, quite literally, for that rock, stone that cannot be included into communication. You know, as we usually put it in simplistic terms, the analyst just sits as an idiot and frustrates you, no? You like to engage him in some communication, no, he's literally that excess, that resists it. And that's then the structure of the analytic discourse, in the sense that this stands here for supposed knowledge, but it's more ambiguous, in the sense of, you know, this is called transference, that you suppose that the analyst knows in advance the meaning of your symptom. At the same time, it's more complex because you remember that this was the place of truth. So you can also say that an analyst also stands for that in the analytic discourse only, knowledge, which, to put it in very simplistic terms, otherwise functions in this neutral way, in the fake way, for example, of the university discourse, where you just make objective research, but only in the discourse of, only in the analytic link, knowledge arrives at the place of truth. And I think the way Lacan refers here to the notion of truth, it has something to do with the way Alain Badiou does it. What do I mean by this? As we all know, in psychoanalysis especially, we know how knowledge does not necessarily involve truth, even if it is a true knowledge in the sense of adequate knowledge. For example, we all know, I hope they're so well known, Lacan's outrageous statement that even if, it's a little bit male chauvinist, but nonetheless, even if a jealous husband claims that his wife is cheating him, that she sleeps around with other men, even if they are all true, his jealousy is still pathological. So that, you know, the factual truth can be, or adequacy, can be combined with untruth. Why? Let me give you a much more traumatic example, which makes the same point clearly. Let's take what Nazis claimed about the Jews. I think we have to go to the end here and claim, even if, okay, not all, I wouldn't go so far, but even if some of what they claimed was true, nonetheless, anti-Semitism was totally a lie, a fake. Why? I think that that's my general point, that the moment you even think about endorsing, accepting discussion at this level, like for example, let's say, I don't know, I'm a Nazi, you are an honest liberal, and I say Jews seduce our young girls, Jews exploit us, and I say this. You say, no, this is a lie. Then comes a naive university neutral idiot and says, oh, it's difficult, let's take an objective look at it. You sell your soul to the devil if you do this. Because let's be clear, the result will be unambiguous. Yes, the Nazis exaggerated it, but not quite. Because, wait a minute, now say something horrible. Many Jews were also rich in Germany, so yes, they definitely exploited Germans. On the other hand, I hope so, it's normal. I think that some Jews definitely probably were seducing German girls. Why not? You know what I mean? Why is this false? Because the true, how to put it, the Nazis here, even if it were to be true, but it wasn't, of course, they lied in the guise of truth. Because the true question is not, is it true what they are claiming about the Jews? The true question is why, in order to sustain their politics, they need this fantasy of the Jew. Why they need this phantasmatic figure of the Jew. And incidentally, it's the same, I think, even today with Iraq. Here I think that many fake leftists fell into the trap of accepting the terms of the debate. And when Americans said we have to attack Iraq because it's a terrible regime and so on. No, the point is not to argue, no, Saddam is good. Of course he's bad. But I claim the paradox is that even if all the statements about Saddam were true, and incidentally, now I say something horrible, even I was slightly surprised. I thought they would find some weapons of mass destruction. Or at least, I mean, couldn't CIA or American army apply the old creative lesson of drug-busting American police? They don't have drugs, you plant them, then, my God, we live in 21st century. No, but my point is that you get my point. This is not the true question. The true question is not, is it true what they claim about Saddam? The true question is a totally different one, is what kind of new logic of hegemony, new world order is established in this way and so on and so on. I think that even to accept these terms and then to argue, you put yourself into a totally idiotic position, you know. When there you have to argue, oh, but it's not so bad, some people nonetheless supported Saddam. That's not our debate, my God. That's not the level. That's not, again, that's not the level of truth. So to put it in these old previous terms of enunciated enunciation, truth would be, here we have knowledge at the level of truth. That is to say, at the level of your, which also affects your position of enunciation. So let me just briefly recapitulate and then I will go on. So if a political leader says, I'm your master, let my will be done, then this direct assertion of authority can first be hystericized when the subject starts to doubt his qualifications as a leader. Am I really a master? What is it in me that legitimizes me to act as a master? Then it can be masked authority in the guise of the university discourse. Like, I'm asking you to do this, and in asking you, I only follow the insight into objective historical necessity. So I'm not your leader. I'm merely the servant of history, or it's only expertise and so on. Or you can adopt the analyst's position of precisely occupying the very place of the impossibility of failure of the discourse. But now comes the second part, which I will try to make as short as possible. On the other hand, I must emphasize that here I totally agree with Derrida, who likes to draw attention to the predominance of this metaphysical, quantified, phallogocentric notion of linear time, which you simply measure. With my talk, I want to contribute towards subverting this notion of time. Okay, let's go on. So, how really does it work then, university discourse? Let me return to it now. Here, it did strike me that what Agamben and others develop as biopolitics, it's precisely this. This would be biopolitics. Expert knowledge, this would be, here can nicely stand for pure life. Expert knowledge, pure life, and so on. But the truth of it would nonetheless be that this is still, that it doesn't really work at that. It is still sustained by a master signifier addressing the subject, but in a more refined way by the failure of this. My good friend Eric Center, in his wonderful book, My Own Private Germany, developed this in a wonderful way in the figure who is maybe the founding figure of our modern paranoia, Schreber, Freud's case, where, as you know, the problem of Schreber was precisely to assume the symbolic mandate, master signifier, which defines you. It's typical, if you read Freud's analysis of Schreber, or directly his memoirs, that all the psychotic crises occurred precisely when he professionally succeeded immediately, or was in a position, like when he was nominated as a judge of crisis, he couldn't assume it. And on the other hand, as you know, Schreber's father was the one, that is to say that crazy, even now they have in Germany this disciplinary procedure. He was the original Foucauldian pedagogical figure. So I think it's nonetheless crucial to emphasize the codependence of this level. That you have the failure of the master discourse, of traditional symbolic authority, and then biopolitics enters, the two aspects together. However, and now comes the key message that I want to deliver. However, the object, pure life, of the discourse of university has two aspects which appear as belonging to two opposite ideological spaces. But I think precisely they are two aspects of the same, and this is crucial. First, we have, of course, a simple reduction of humans to bare life. Topic of Homo sacer and so on. Or humans as disponible objects of the expert knowledge. Then we have a topic today which is apparently the opposite one. That is because when I say Homo sacer and defend Agamben in front of my friends, I always get the same answer. But are you crazy? What about the opposite tendency, which is not only did we ever talk so much about human rights, but isn't it that today we are so hypersensitive to vulnerability, harassment, and so on and so on? Okay, that's the other aspect. The respect for the vulnerable other brought to extreme. The attitude of narcissistic subjectivity which experienced itself as vulnerable, constantly exposed to a multitude of potential harassments. And I think the extreme articulation of this attitude is Richard Rorty, who in his Contingency, Irony, Solidarity even defines in this way a human being. He says a human being is somebody who can be hurt. Now this is, I think, a pretty sad position. If we define as the ultimate dimension of a human being that which can suffer, that which can be hurt. Now, of course, again you will say, but is there a stronger contrast than the one between the respect for the other's vulnerability and the reduction of the other to mere life, regulated by administrative knowledge? But what if nonetheless these two stances rely on the same root? What if they are two aspects of one and the same underlying attitude? That is to say, what if what is beneath both of them, the underlying thing, is precisely this failure of the master signifier, that is to say, the refusal, the rejection of any higher cause, as we put it, the notion that the ultimate goal of life is survival, is life itself. So you got it. I claim that this extreme, what they share in common, Homo sacer reduction to bare life, and this excessively sensitive late bourgeois narcissism. Oh my God, you laugh at me, hoo-hoo, I'm hurt, I look at a woman who I harassed her already, is precisely the reduction of the other to this pure minimal life. They share survivalism as the ultimate attitude. And I think that nowhere is the complicity of these two levels clearer than, now I say something horrible, than in the opposition to death penalty. Precisely because death is the ultimate traumatic point of biopolitics, of the politics of the administration of life. Namely, I claim that, did you notice how, this is what always bothers me, I'm not privately for death penalty, for everyone. I think that only those who deserve it should be. No, but seriously, what bothers me that the usual argumentation against death penalty, it doesn't work, it doesn't prevent, it's barbarian, and so on and so on. And especially this socialist reasoning, which is, but people are victims of circumstances and so on and so on. It's precisely that you have this subjectivizing reduction to mere life. Precisely, you are reduced to object of biopolitics, and as such, of course, you can be the object of even cruel administrative measures, but no death penalty. So I think the rise of what Agamben calls this homo sacer concentration camps, little machinery, and the rejection of death penalty, for me, are strictly, in this sense, strictly correlative phenomena. Even with regard to war, it's more ambiguous. The movie I really hate is one of them, is Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan. Why? It appears a subversive movie, horror of the war, but first, it's an abstract horror of the war. The message is every war, blah, blah. What I find so suspicious in it, I have this fantasy that this movie was ordered by Colin Powell to sustain his doctrine. Because, Powell doctrine is purely mechanized war with no death, no victims on our side. And this would be a perfect counterpoint to this Saving Private Ryan attitude. Now we came to what I see as the central feature of this university discourse. The central paradox of, as it were, condensing the opposite. Because I think in this university discourse, opposite coincide. In what sense? In the traditional master discourse, you have this clear contrast in the sense of this is permitted, this is not permitted, prohibition contains you, and so on and so on. But what we get in today's so-called permissive society of control is, I claim, that it's no longer transgression, reaction, and so on. It is as if, the same product tries to be already its counter-agent. What do I mean by this? For example, you know that on today's market you find a whole series of products deprived of their malignant property. Coffee without caffeine, cream without fat, beer without alcohol, and I think the list goes on. We have virtual sex, which is precisely sex without sex. We get Colin Powell doctrine, which is precisely war without warfare, without that on our side, of course. And I claim incidentally that the same goes for multiculturalism. It's the respect of the other without the real other, because in multiculturalism, the other, it is sublime other, folkloric dances, and so on, all that holistic approach, and so on and so on. So let me go on. So I think that this is the paradox of what, following Nietzsche, we could designate as today's hedonistic, Nietzsche's term, lust man. Everything is permitted, you can enjoy everything, but it has to be deprived of its substance, which makes it dangerous. Coffee, yes, without caffeine. Beer, yes, without alcohol. Meat, yes, without fat, and so on and so on. Here, I don't have time to go it, we could elaborate this Lacan's paradoxes of Lacan's paraphrase of Dostoevsky, which are, if God doesn't exist, everything is prohibited. That's for me the paradox of today's permissivity. Yes, God is dead, we live in a permissive universe. That is to say, you should strive for pleasures and happiness, but, now comes the trick, in order to really enjoy a full life of happiness, you should avoid dangerous excess, not harass others, take care of your health, and so on and so on. So, precisely when you want to have a life of full pleasure dedicated just to your happiness, you end up in a totally regulated society. I think that there never was a society which at the level of what Foucault referred to as micro-practice was as regulated as is today's society. And the opposite is also true, namely, the other version, which is, if against Dostoevsky, if there is God, everything is permitted. But it's the whole point of so-called fundamentalism. We act directly on behalf of God, necessity, whatever, so who are you to, it's permitted. So let's go on. So today's hedonism combines pleasure with constraint, but not, that's now crucial, in a way which is totally opposite to this old antique version of proper measure, because this was, to cut it short, the pre-Kantian ethics. No, proper measure. Sex, yes, but not too much. Eat, but yes. No, today it's not the right measure between pleasure and constraint and so on. It is that, it is a kind of a more direct coincidence of the opposites, where again, a thing, it's already its own remedy, its own counteraction. The vulgar example is one that I encountered in California 3 years ago, chocolate laxative.